Hello. Welcome to the channel. Today, we're diving into some terrifying stories that take place in hospitals, places where lives are saved, but where chilling, unexplained events can also occur. Have you ever had a paranormal or creepy experience in a hospital? If so, share it with us in the comments. And while you're here, let us know where you're watching from. Get ready to hear tales of ghostly apparitions, strange paranormal activity, and eerie occurrences that will make you think twice about hospital hallways. These are stories that will grab your attention and keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end. And if you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button to join the Deep channel so you don't miss out on more spine-chilling content. Your support helps us keep bringing you stories that send shivers down your spine. Ready to dive into the unknown? Let's begin. Military ghosts won't rest. The hospital in Lincolnshire stood as a relic of a distant, bloodier time. Originally built as a military hospital during the First World War, its walls had witnessed the suffering of countless soldiers, their injuries both visible and unseen. Though the war had ended over a century ago, the hospital's dark history still lingered like a shadow over the town. Its once pristine corridors had long since fallen into disrepair, and few dared to enter its doors willingly. Stories of strange occurrences, ghostly sightings, and eerie sounds had become part of the local folklore. People said the hospital was cursed, that the souls of soldiers who had died in agony still wandered its halls, unable to find peace. Even in the modern age, where skepticism often outweighed superstition, the stories persisted. Those who worked in the hospital, now serving as a care facility for long-term patients, whispered of cold spots, voices in the night, and objects moving on their own. For many, the hospital was more than just a place of healing, it was a place of fear. One such patient, Samuel Holloway, had recently been admitted after suffering a severe illness. A man in his 60s, he had lived his entire life in Lincolnshire and had heard the tales of the hospital's haunted past. But like many others, he had dismissed them as mere stories, a way for the townspeople to keep the memory of the war alive. That changed the night he was moved to the old wing. The old wing had been closed off for years, left to rot with its cracked tiles and peeling wallpaper. But due to renovations in the main building, Samuel found himself in a room that hadn't been occupied for decades. As the nurses wheeled his bed down the long, echoing corridor, Samuel felt a chill settle over him. The air was different here, thick and oppressive, as though the walls themselves were watching. That night, as Samuel lay in his bed, he began to hear it. At first, it was subtle, the faint sound of footsteps in the distance, as if someone were pacing just outside his room. But when he looked, the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. A cold sweat broke out on his skin as he listened, frozen in his bed. His pulse quickened, and his breath came in short gasps. There was something out there, something unseen. As the footsteps grew nearer, a faint voice joined them. It was low, barely above a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It sounded like someone crying. The sound was filled with pain, the kind of deep, soul-wrenching agony that one would expect from a wounded soldier. Samuel gripped the sheets, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to call for help, but his voice caught in his throat. The air in the room grew colder, the shadows in the corners of the room seeming to stretch and twist in the dim light. He wasn't alone in that room, and whatever was there wasn't human. Samuel lay in bed, paralyzed by fear as the unseen presence in the hallway seemed to draw closer. The faint crying grew louder, echoing through the silence of the old wing. His heart raced as he struggled to make sense of the sounds, but deep down, he already knew, these weren't the cries of any living patient. The walls of this hospital had absorbed the pain and suffering of countless soldiers, and it seemed that their torment was far from over. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had lost all meaning as the haunting noises continued to swirl around him. Samuel's eyes darted to the corners of the room, where the shadows twisted unnaturally, as if something was lurking just out of sight. The air grew colder still, his breath visible in the pale light from the hallway. Then, the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise itself. For a moment, Samuel dared to hope that whatever presence had been outside had left. But that hope was quickly shattered when the door to his room slowly creaked open. There was no one standing there. No nurse, no orderly, no one. But the door continued to open wider, revealing the dark, empty hallway beyond. The dim light flickered as if struggling to stay lit, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. Samuel's pulse quickened as a figure slowly appeared at the doorway, not solid, but barely visible, as though it were made of mist. It was tall, with broad shoulders, and its head was lowered as if weighed down by some unseen burden. Samuel's mind raced. He wanted to move, to scream, but he couldn't. His body was frozen in place, gripped by the cold and the overwhelming sense of dread. The figure stepped into the room, its form shifting and flickering in the faint light. It didn't look at Samuel, but he could feel its presence bearing down on him, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't until the figure passed by his bed that Samuel caught a glimpse of its face, or what was left of it. The features were gaunt, the eyes hollow and sunken, but what truly terrified him was the uniform. The figure was dressed in the tattered remains of a military uniform, its fabric stained with mud and blood from a battle long since fought. The soldier. One of the many who had come to this hospital during the war, seeking help, seeking solace. But something had gone wrong. Samuel's mind raced with thoughts of the stories he had heard, the ones about soldiers who never found peace, who were trapped in the place of their greatest suffering. The figure stopped at the window, staring out into the night as if waiting for something. Samuel could hear the faint, labored breathing of the spirit, the sound of a life that had ended too soon. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and slowly faded from view, leaving Samuel alone once more. But the sense of unease remained. Samuel knew that whatever haunted these halls wasn't finished. And neither was he. The night dragged on, and though the figure had disappeared, Samuel remained wide awake. His mind couldn't escape the image of the soldier, his hollow eyes, his uniform still marked by the horrors of war. The air in the room was stifling, thick with an unnatural presence that clung to Samuel like a heavy fog. Every creak of the old building, every flicker of the dim lights, sent waves of unease through him. He wasn't sure when he fell asleep, but his rest was anything but peaceful. His dreams were filled with flashes of battlefields, soldiers screaming in agony, the deafening roar of artillery fire, and the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that only war can bring. He saw the hospital as it had been during the war, overrun with wounded men, their pain echoing through the corridors. And standing in the center of it all was the same figure, the soldier, watching silently as the chaos unfolded around him. Samuel woke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, save for the faint light seeping in from the hallway. But something was different. The air was colder than before, and the oppressive weight of the presence in the room was stronger, more suffocating. He sat up slowly, his body tense, his ears straining to hear anything beyond the unsettling silence. And then he heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails scraping against wood. It was coming from the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. Samuel's throat tightened, and his pulse quickened. He didn't want to look, but he knew he had to. Slowly, he turned toward the door, his eyes wide with fear. The sound grew louder still, until it felt as if it was right outside the door. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as the doorknob began to rattle, slowly at first, then more violently, as if something was desperately trying to get inside. His body froze in place. Whatever was on the other side wasn't human. He could feel it, the cold, dark energy pressing against the door, waiting for its chance to enter. The rattling stopped abruptly, leaving only silence behind. But the silence was even worse, filled with an anticipation that made Samuel's skin crawl. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. And then, without warning, the door creaked open once again. This time, there was no misty figure, no ghostly soldier stepping into the room. Instead, the hallway beyond was filled with the sound of footsteps, heavy, marching footsteps, as if a battalion of soldiers was passing through. The sound grew louder, echoing through the old building, but no one appeared. The hall remained empty, even as the footsteps continued. Samuel gripped the edges of his bed, his knuckles white with tension. The unseen presence, the soldiers that had once passed through this hospital, were still marching, still trapped in their endless, tormented routine. And they were coming closer. The cold air pressed against his skin as the footsteps drew nearer, until they were right outside his door. And then, just as before, they stopped. The door stood wide open, but the hallway was empty, save for the faint whispers that now echoed in the distance. Samuel's heart pounded as he sat motionless in the bed, his eyes fixed on the open doorway. The heavy footsteps had ceased, leaving behind an eerie silence that filled the old hospital. The air was thick with dread, and Samuel could feel the weight of the unseen soldiers still lingering. He knew he couldn't stay here any longer. Something far darker than he had ever imagined was trapped within these walls, and it was reaching out for him. With a trembling hand, Samuel reached for the call button to summon the nurse. But the small device, once a source of comfort, now felt useless in the face of whatever was haunting the hospital. The shadows in the room seemed to move of their own accord, stretching and twisting as if they were alive, creeping toward him with deliberate intent. He had to leave. Pushing the covers aside, Samuel swung his legs over the edge of the bed. His body was weak, but the urgency of the situation gave him the strength to stand. The cold floor sent a jolt through his bare feet, but he pressed on, moving toward the door. The hallway was empty, save for the faint flicker of the overhead lights casting unsettling shadows against the walls. As he stepped into the hallway, the oppressive weight of the hospital seemed to grow heavier. The cold air wrapped around him like a vice, making it difficult to breathe. He had only taken a few steps when the whispers began again, low, hushed voices, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. They echoed through the corridor, coming from all directions, as though the walls themselves were alive with the voices of the past. Samuel's pulse quickened as he moved forward, his pace increasing with every step. The voices grew louder, and with them came the faint sound of marching footsteps, slowly approaching from behind. He didn't dare look back. The spirits of the soldiers were still trapped here, doomed to repeat their final moments over and over again, and Samuel knew he had to escape before they pulled him into their eternal nightmare. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, but finally, Samuel spotted the dim glow of the emergency exit sign at the far end. Relief surged through him, but it was quickly snatched away as the footsteps grew closer, their rhythmic march growing more menacing. The shadows around him began to close in, thickening like a living entity, reaching out for him with cold, invisible hands. Panic took hold of him as he sprinted toward the exit, his breath ragged and his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers had grown into frantic, desperate cries, the voices of the dead soldiers calling out in agony. Their pain echoed through the hospital, pulling at him, trying to drag him back into their world of torment. With one final burst of strength, Samuel reached the door and shoved it open. The cold night air hit him like a wall, and he stumbled out into the darkness, gasping for breath. The hospital loomed behind him, its windows dark and foreboding, the whispers and footsteps fading as he put distance between himself and the cursed building. Samuel didn't stop running until he was far from the hospital grounds, the memories of the spirits and the haunting presence forever burned into his mind. He would never return to that place. The soldiers who had suffered within its walls were still there, their spirits trapped, seeking solace that would never come. Trapped in a haunted asylum. Dr. Hannah Kim, fresh out of university with her psychology degree, had heard the rumors about Ganjiam Psychiatric Hospital. It was said to be one of the most haunted places in South Korea, a facility with a dark history of neglect, suffering, and death. Patients abandoned in its halls during its early years were left to deteriorate, both mentally and physically. Many died within its walls, their stories forgotten, except by those who claimed to have seen their spirits wandering the corridors. Hannah, however, wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. She was logical, scientific, and excited about her first real assignment. Her new role as a psychologist brought her to Ganjiam, where she was tasked with overseeing the patients left in the psychiatric ward. Despite the hospital's sinister reputation, she arrived at her first night shift with a sense of curiosity. The building itself stood in silence, its tall, gray walls casting eerie shadows in the dim evening light. As she walked through the front doors, Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital was watching her. The air inside was cold, unnaturally so, and the corridors stretched out endlessly, illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. She passed by rows of empty rooms, their doors slightly ajar as if something, or someone, had recently been inside. The nurses she met were quiet, almost distant, as they briefed her on the night's schedule. There were only a handful of patients left in this wing, they told her, but they all shared one thing in common: none of them spoke. It was as if whatever trauma had befallen them had stolen their voices. They communicated in whispers, nods, and scribbled notes. Hannah felt a strange chill crawl up her spine as she listened to the nurse's words. But she brushed it off. Hospitals always had a strange atmosphere at night. As her shift began, Hannah settled into the rhythm of the night. The patients, most of whom were sleeping or staring blankly at the walls, seemed harmless enough. But something about the air, the silence, was unnerving. As the hours ticked by, she noticed subtle oddities. The lights in the far corridor would flicker more often, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. The faint sound of footsteps echoed down the empty hallways, though when she checked, no one was there. It wasn't until midnight that things began to shift. Hannah was making her rounds when she heard something strange, a soft, distant voice, as though someone was whispering her name. She froze in her tracks, heart racing. The corridor in front of her stretched out like a tunnel, the shadows deepening. She told herself it was her mind playing tricks, but the voice came again, clearer this time. Her name, whispered softly, almost pleadingly, from one of the patient rooms. Hannah hesitated. The door to room 8 stood slightly ajar, just like the others. She had checked it earlier, no one was inside. Taking a deep breath, she stepped toward the door, the cold air brushing against her skin like icy fingers. She reached for the handle, pushing it open slowly, her heart pounding as the door creaked in protest. Inside, the room was empty. But the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her lingered, sending a shiver down her spine. After the unsettling encounter in room 8, Hannah felt her nerves on edge. The hospital's silence seemed heavier, thicker, like a shroud draped over the building. The cold air pressed against her, and the faint echo of her own footsteps seemed to follow her everywhere. But she had a job to do, and Hannah wasn't one to let fear cloud her judgment. She returned to her rounds, telling herself that it was just an old building, nothing more. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in Gonjiam grew even more oppressive. The long corridors stretched out like endless tunnels, their fluorescent lights flickering with an almost rhythmic pulse. Hannah began to notice patterns in the flickers, almost as if they were communicating, but she pushed the thought away. It was just her tired mind playing tricks, she told herself. Hospitals could do that to anyone. But then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like distant conversations happening just beyond her hearing. She could never quite make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, desperate, as though someone or something was trying to reach out to her. The whispers seemed to follow her from room to room, growing louder as the hours passed. She tried to ignore them, focusing on the patients, most of whom remained eerily still in their beds. But it was hard to ignore the way their eyes seemed to follow her movements, even when they didn't speak or move. One patient, in particular, caught her attention. He was an elderly man, frail and pale, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. He lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, but when Hannah approached his bed, his gaze snapped toward her. Hannah froze as his lips began to move, forming silent words she couldn't hear. The whispers in the air grew louder, though they didn't seem to come from him. Her heart pounded in her chest as the man's eyes locked onto hers, his mouth continuing to form those strange, silent words. It was as if he was trying to warn her, of what, she didn't know. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed down the hallway, breaking the tension like a thunderclap. Hannah jumped, her breath catching in her throat. The sound came from the far end of the wing, where the older part of the hospital lay, abandoned and crumbling. The area had been sealed off for years, but now, it seemed as though something, or someone, had moved inside. She hesitated for only a moment before she made her way down the hallway. Every step felt heavier, the air colder as she approached the source of the noise. The whispers followed her, growing more frantic, as if they were urging her to stop, to turn back. But Hannah pushed forward, determined to uncover the truth behind the unsettling events of the night. When she reached the door to the old wing, her hand hovered over the handle. The door creaked slightly, as if inviting her in. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open, stepping into the darkness beyond. The cold hit her like a wave, and the shadows seemed to swallow her whole. In the stillness of the darkened corridor, the whispers stopped. But the sense of being watched remained. Hannah stood at the threshold of the abandoned wing, her heart racing. The silence that followed her into the corridor was suffocating, thicker than before. The air felt stagnant, and the dim light barely penetrated the darkness ahead. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity, mixed with a sense of duty, pushed her forward. As she stepped inside, the cold air wrapped around her like icy fingers. The corridor stretched out before her, lined with old patient rooms, their doors ajar. The faint scent of decay lingered in the air, and the floor beneath her feet creaked with every step. It was clear that no one had been down this hallway in years, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, almost as if they were alive, moving just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. Hannah's breath came in shallow gasps as she passed by the empty rooms. Each door she passed seemed to groan slightly, as though something was stirring within. The whispers had returned, faint at first, but now they echoed around her, growing louder with each step. They weren't just random voices anymore, they were calling her name. Her footsteps slowed as she neared the end of the hallway. The door at the very end was different from the others. Unlike the cracked and peeling doors she had passed, this one was pristine, untouched by time. A heavy feeling of dread settled in her chest as she reached for the handle. The whispers intensified, now urgent, almost pleading, but Hannah couldn't stop herself. She had to know what was behind that door. With a trembling hand, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint light from the hallway. At first glance, it appeared empty, just another abandoned room in this forsaken hospital. But as Hannah stepped inside, she noticed something strange. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that she didn't recognize. They seemed to pulse in the dim light, casting eerie shadows that danced across the floor. And then she saw it. In the center of the room stood a figure, pale, emaciated, and barely human. Its eyes were wide, staring blankly ahead, and its body was twisted in unnatural angles, as though it had been contorted by some unseen force. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge Hannah's presence, but the air around it felt heavy, oppressive, as though the very room was suffocating under its weight. Hannah's heart raced as she backed away, her body trembling with fear. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The figure in the room remained still, but its presence filled the space, overwhelming her senses. Just as she reached the door, the lights in the hallway flickered violently, casting the room into complete darkness. Hannah's breath hitched in her throat, her hand fumbling for the door handle. The growl grew louder, filling her ears, and for a brief moment, she felt something cold brush against her arm, something that shouldn't have been there. She pulled the door open and stumbled back into the hallway, gasping for air. The whispers returned, softer now, but persistent, as if they were following her. She wasn't alone in this hospital. And whatever was in that room, it wasn't human. Hannah's breathing was erratic as she backed away from the door, her mind racing to process what she had just seen. The whispers were relentless now, surrounding her like an invisible chorus, their words indistinguishable but filled with urgency. The cold in the hospital seemed to intensify, seeping into her bones, and the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. She forced herself to move, turning back down the hallway, but every step felt heavier. The lights flickered above her, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to reach out from the walls. The hospital had come alive, and it was clear that whatever haunted this place was no longer content to stay hidden. As she neared the exit to the old wing, Hannah heard it again, a faint whisper, closer this time. It wasn't like the others. This voice was clear, distinct, and unmistakably human. It called her name, slowly, deliberately, like a dark lullaby echoing through the empty halls. Her blood ran cold as she realized the voice was coming from behind her. With a shaky breath, Hannah turned. The corridor stretched out behind her, empty and still, but the voice persisted, growing louder with every second. It was no longer a whisper, it was a plea, a desperate call for help. But there was no one there. Panic gripped her as she stumbled back toward the main wing. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, and she could feel the weight of the hospital pressing down on her, suffocating her with every breath. The whispers merged into a cacophony of voices, each one filled with pain and terror, as if the souls of those who had suffered in the hospital were crying out all at once. She pushed through the door and into the main wing, her body trembling with fear. But as she crossed the threshold, the voices stopped. The oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, though the chill remained. Hannah leaned against the wall, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. But the relief was short-lived. As she steadied herself, Hannah noticed something strange. The hospital, though quieter now, felt different. The air was still cold, and the lights above her flickered in the same erratic pattern, but the presence she had felt so strongly in the old wing had followed her. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, stretching and shifting unnaturally. She wasn't alone. Hannah's thoughts raced. The patients, the whispers, the figure in the room, all of it was connected, a dark thread running through the very fabric of the hospital. Whatever had happened here all those years ago had left a stain, a scar that had never healed. The souls of the patients who had suffered and died in Ganjiam were still here, trapped in a never-ending cycle of torment. And now, they had turned their attention to her. The whispers returned, softer this time, as if they were bidding her farewell. But Hannah knew better. This wasn't over. The hospital had let her leave, but it had marked her. The shadows clung to her like a second skin, and she could feel the cold presence lingering just beyond her sight. As she finally made her way toward the exit, the sense of dread lifted slightly, but Hannah knew that the spirits of Ganjiam would never truly leave her. The hospital had become a part of her, its dark history intertwined with her own. And as she stepped into the night air, she realized one thing: she would never be the same again. Terrifying night in a haunted ward. The hospital on the outskirts of Berlin had always carried a dark history. Built in the early 1900s, it had once served as a key location during wartime, even rumored to have been used by the infamous dictator during the height of Germany's darkest days. Over the years, its halls had witnessed countless tragedies, patients who never left, doctors who disappeared without explanation, and whispers of strange, unexplained occurrences that lingered in the air. The building itself was a testament to the past, its once grand architecture now crumbling and overgrown with vines. Despite its eerie reputation, the hospital was still in use. In the quiet town nearby, the locals told stories of strange happenings, of ghostly figures seen walking through the abandoned wings at night, and of the unexplained chills that filled the air in certain rooms. But these were just stories, or so the staff told themselves. On a cold, rainy night, a group of nurses arrived for their night shift. The weather matched the mood of the hospital, gloomy, with the promise of something unsettling in the air. Among them was Greta, a seasoned nurse who had worked at the hospital for years, and two younger nurses, Ank and Lucas, who had only recently started their shifts in the eerie building. As they settled in for the long night ahead, the hospital was unusually quiet. The rain tapped softly against the windows, and the dim lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the peeling walls. The power had been unstable for weeks, but no one could have predicted what would happen next. Just after midnight, the hospital was plunged into complete darkness. The power went out without warning, and the emergency generators, which were supposed to kick in, remained silent. The building was swallowed by the pitch-black night, and the usual hum of machinery and the soft beeps of monitors were replaced by an unnerving silence. Greta, with her years of experience, remained calm, though even she could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in around them. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, their depths hidden in the shadows. She instructed Hank and Lucas to stay close as they fumbled for flashlights, their beams flickering weakly in the oppressive blackness. But something was wrong. The darkness felt alive, as if it were breathing, moving. The hospital's cold, empty halls now seemed to whisper with unseen voices, and the temperature dropped sharply, sending chills down their spines. The three nurses moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the empty corridors. As they made their way toward the generator room to check what had happened, a faint sound reached their ears, a distant, low hum, like the murmur of voices far away. The sound grew louder, but when they stopped to listen, it faded again. Hank shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her as she glanced nervously at Greta. This was no ordinary power outage. Something else was lurking in the darkened hospital, and whatever it was, they were not alone. The further Greta, Hank, and Lucas ventured into the dark corridors of the hospital, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the soft tapping of rain against the windows and the occasional creak of the old building settling into the night. The narrow beam of their flashlights cut through the darkness, but it wasn't enough to push back the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to them. As they neared the generator room, the strange hum they had heard earlier returned, this time louder and more distinct. It wasn't just a noise, it was voices, low and unintelligible, like a distant conversation happening just out of reach. Greta, leading the group, stopped abruptly. Hank and Lucas followed suit, exchanging nervous glances. The voices seemed to be coming from all around them, echoing through the walls of the hospital. But no one else was supposed to be here. Greta, trying to maintain her composure, motioned for the others to follow. They moved forward, their footsteps hesitant, as the voices seemed to follow them. The temperature in the hospital continued to drop, their breath visible in the cold air. The once familiar halls now felt foreign, as if the hospital had become a living entity, watching them with unseen eyes. Just as they approached the door to the generator room, the lights of their flashlights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to shift and dance on their own. Hank gasped, pointing toward one of the darkened corners. For a brief moment, they all saw it, a figure, standing at the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, motionless, and dressed in what looked like an old hospital uniform. But when Greta shone her flashlight in its direction, the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows. Lucas stepped back, his voice shaky as he whispered to Greta that they needed to leave, that something wasn't right. But Greta, though unnerved, was determined. They had to find out what was happening, and the generator room was their only hope of restoring power to the hospital. She urged them forward, despite the growing fear gnawing at her gut. Inside the generator room, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of oil. The machines stood silent, as cold and lifeless as the rest of the building. Greta approached the main control panel, but as she reached for the switch, a sudden gust of icy air swept through the room. The door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging them into an even deeper darkness. Hank let out a terrified cry as the flashlight in her hand flickered once more before going out completely. The room was pitch black now, the only sound the frantic breathing of the nurses. The voices outside the door grew louder, more urgent, as if they were closing in on the room. Lucas frantically tried to reopen the door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as though the very building was conspiring to trap them. In the suffocating darkness, Greta realized they were not alone. Whatever haunted the hospital had awakened, and it wasn't about to let them leave so easily. The pitch-black room felt like a tomb, the air thick with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. Greta's heart raced as the sounds outside the generator room intensified, whispers, murmurs, and now the distinct sound of footsteps slowly approaching the door. Lucas continued to struggle with the door handle, but it was as if something was holding it shut, trapping them inside. Hank, now shaking with fear, pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow as she tried to stifle the rising panic. The temperature in the room continued to drop, and every exhaled breath created a mist in the freezing air. It was no longer just the darkness that terrified them, it was the growing certainty that they were not alone. Greta's mind raced. She had always been skeptical of the stories surrounding the hospital, brushing them off as old superstitions, but now, faced with the undeniable presence of something unnatural, she found herself questioning everything. The room was so silent that the sound of her own heartbeat echoed in her ears. The footsteps outside stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the eerie quiet. Then, without warning, the lights in the room flickered to life. The sudden brightness was almost blinding after so long in the dark, but it did nothing to comfort them. Instead, it illuminated something far worse, shadows that didn't belong. They stretched along the walls, twisting and moving as though they had a life of their own. The shadows seemed to pulse, dark and fluid, as if they were watching the nurses, waiting. Greta stepped forward, her flashlight now working again, and aimed it at the door. But what she saw made her blood run cold. The door, which Lucas had been desperately trying to open, now stood slightly ajar, as if inviting them to step out. But beyond it, the hallway was dark, too dark. The shadows from inside the room seemed to spill out into the corridor, making the space feel endless, a void that would swallow them whole if they dared to leave. Ank's voice cracked as she whispered that they shouldn't go out there, that something was waiting for them. Lucas, pale and visibly shaken, nodded in agreement, his hands still gripping the door handle. Greta knew they couldn't stay in the generator room forever, but the fear that gripped her was unlike anything she had ever felt before. Every instinct told her to stay away from whatever lurked outside, but they had no choice. Gathering what courage she could, Greta motioned for Lucas and Ank to follow her. They stepped cautiously out into the corridor, the oppressive silence closing in around them once more. The hospital seemed even more unfamiliar now, its long hallways stretching into nothingness, filled with the same dark, twisting shadows that had haunted them in the generator room. As they moved down the hallway, the whispers returned, louder now, echoing off the walls. The shadows shifted, darting in and out of the corners of their vision. Greta tightened her grip on the flashlight, the beam barely cutting through the darkness. Every step felt heavier, as though the hospital itself was trying to pull them deeper into its depths. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind them, the sound reverberating through the empty halls. They all spun around, their hearts pounding in their chests. Something had moved. Something was coming for them. The sound of the crash behind them sent a wave of terror through the group. Greta turned to face the direction of the noise, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The shadows in the hallway seemed to thicken, moving with a life of their own. For a moment, the three nurses stood frozen in place, unable to decide whether to run or confront whatever was coming toward them. The whispers grew louder, filling the corridor with a chorus of voices, each one more desperate and incoherent than the last. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, feeding on their fear, growing stronger with every passing second. Lucas stepped back, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Ank clutched his arm, her eyes wide with terror as the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed through the hall. Greta knew they had to move. The hospital was no longer just a place, it was a malevolent force, intent on trapping them within its haunted walls. She grabbed Lucas and Ank by the arms and urged them forward, their footsteps quickening as they ran through the darkened corridor. But the hospital wouldn't let them go so easily. The lights flickered violently, plunging them into darkness before briefly illuminating their path again. Shadows darted across the walls, and the oppressive chill in the air deepened. As they turned a corner, the door to the old wing slammed shut ahead of them with a deafening bang, sealing off their exit. Panic gripped them as they searched for another way out. The whispers followed them, growing louder with each step, and the shadows seemed to close in around them, pushing them toward the heart of the hospital. Greta's mind raced, but she fought to stay calm. They had to find another exit, or they'd be lost in the hospital's labyrinth forever. They stumbled upon a stairwell, its narrow steps leading down into the basement. The air was thick with dampness, and the smell of decay hung in the air. Despite the growing fear in her chest, Greta motioned for them to descend. It was their only option. The stairwell was dark, the walls lined with peeling paint and rusted metal railings. As they descended into the basement, the voices seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on them like a weight. But Greta knew better, this silence wasn't safe. It was the calm before the storm. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a narrow, dimly lit hallway. A faint glow came from the exit sign at the far end, their only hope of escape. Greta urged them forward, the sound of their footsteps echoing unnaturally through the stillness. Suddenly, the shadows in the hallway shifted. The figure they had glimpsed earlier reappeared, standing at the far end near the exit. Its hollow eyes locked onto them, its presence filling the air with a suffocating dread. It took a step toward them, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it was waiting for them to come closer. Greta's heart pounded as she led Lucas and Hank toward the exit, her mind screaming for them to move faster. The figure's presence grew more oppressive with every step, the cold seeping into their bones. But as they neared the door, the figure stopped, its form flickering in the dim light before vanishing into the shadows once more. They burst through the exit door and into the cold night air, gasping for breath as the hospital loomed behind them, dark and silent. The whispers had stopped, the shadows retreating back into the depths of the building. But the feeling of being watched remained, a lingering presence that clung to them even as they ran toward safety. Greta knew they had escaped the hospital, but the horrors they had witnessed would stay with them forever. The hospital's dark past had left its mark, and they would never forget the terror they had faced within its haunted halls. Dark secrets of the Gothic wing. In the heart of Massachusetts stood a hospital that, on the surface, seemed like any other. Built in 1984 and officially opened in 1992, the facility had served thousands of patients over the decades. However, there was one part of the hospital that had earned a darker reputation. Tucked away from the main building was the old wing, a section no one dared to enter, even during the busiest of shifts. Its Gothic architecture loomed over the rest of the hospital like a shadow, the stone gargoyles lining the roof watching over the grounds with hollow eyes. The old wing had been closed off for years, its entrance sealed, though rumors of what happened there continued to spread among the staff. Whispers of ghostly apparitions, strange voices, and even demonic presences filled the hospital halls. It was said that anyone who ventured into the forbidden wing never returned the same. On a particularly stormy evening, Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a seasoned physician with years of experience, found herself on a night shift. The hospital was unusually quiet, save for the howling wind outside that rattled the old windows. It had been a slow night until she received a strange call on the hospital's intercom system. The voice was faint and distorted, but it came from the old wing. Her pulse quickened. She knew it was impossible, no one was assigned to that area, and the old wing had been shut down for years. The hospital staff had long ago stopped questioning the strange occurrences there. But something about the call compelled her to investigate. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something darker, pulling her toward the source. Margaret grabbed a flashlight from the supply closet and made her way through the winding corridors toward the forgotten part of the hospital. The closer she got to the old wing, the colder the air became. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. As she approached the sealed doors of the wing, her flashlight began to flicker as well. The entrance to the old wing was marked by heavy iron doors, covered in rust and cobwebs. For a moment, Margaret hesitated. The stories she had heard over the years came flooding back to her, the ones about strange figures seen wandering the hallways, about patients who had died under mysterious circumstances. She brushed the thoughts aside and pushed open the door, which groaned loudly as it swung inward. Inside, the air was even colder, thick with the stench of decay and something else, something unidentifiable. The Gothic architecture loomed over her, the high ceilings and ornate stonework creating a sense of dread that settled deep in her chest. The old wing was exactly as the rumors described, untouched, but haunted by an unseen presence. As she ventured deeper into the hallway, she began to hear it, a faint whisper, like voices carried on the wind. They seemed to come from all directions, calling to her, but in a language she didn't understand. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with the sound, and every step she took felt like she was walking deeper into the jaws of something malevolent. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the whispers grew louder. Whatever was waiting for her in the heart of the old wing was not human. Dr. Margaret Sinclair continued deeper into the old wing, her steps slow and deliberate. The whispers surrounded her now, growing louder with each step she took. They were not like anything she had ever heard before, disjointed voices, some pleading, others mocking, but none of them comprehensible. The flashlight in her hand flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the decaying walls. The Gothic architecture, once magnificent, now appeared grotesque, twisted in the dim glow of her faltering light. The air grew colder still, each breath she took visible in the freezing air. Margaret felt a pressure building in her chest, as if the very atmosphere in the old wing was pressing down on her. The deeper she ventured, the more oppressive the sense of dread became. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to leave the wing and never return, but something stronger pulled her forward. The hallway seemed endless, lined with abandoned patient rooms, their doors ajar. Each room appeared untouched, as though frozen in time, yet she could feel the presence of something lurking within. Every now and then, from the corner of her eye, Margaret thought she saw movement, flickers of shadow darting across the threshold of the rooms. But when she turned to look, the hall remained still, the silence broken only by the persistent whispers that grew louder and more urgent. Suddenly, the hallway widened into what appeared to be a waiting area. The old, decaying furniture lay scattered about, covered in dust and grime, and the windows, now cracked and clouded, barely let in any light. Margaret's flashlight flickered once more, casting long shadows across the room. It was here that she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and her heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't alone. Margaret's gaze swept across the room, her breath catching in her throat as she saw them, figures, faint and transparent, standing in the shadows. There were at least 3 of them, their forms barely visible, like ghostly outlines against the decaying walls. They stood motionless, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their presence filling the room with a cold, unnatural energy. The whispers intensified, and for the first time, she understood what they were saying. They were calling her name. Her blood ran cold as the voices became more insistent, beckoning her to come closer. She could feel the pull, the compulsion to step forward, but her body was frozen in place. The air around her thickened, and the figures began to move, slowly advancing toward her. Margaret's mind raced. She had always been logical, skeptical of the supernatural, but there was no denying what she was witnessing. The figures were not human, and they were coming for her. Desperate to escape, she turned and ran, her flashlight casting wild beams of light across the crumbling walls as she fled down the hallway. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more frantic, as if the very walls of the hospital were alive with the voices of the dead. But no matter how fast she ran, the darkness followed her, and the figures, they were getting closer. Margaret ran as fast as her legs would carry her, her heartbeat pounding in her ears as she raced through the narrow, decaying hallway. The figures, those ghostly apparitions, were no longer just whispers in the distance. She could feel them closing in, the cold air tightening around her like invisible hands. Her flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to twist and writhe on the walls as if mocking her fear. The whispers grew louder, but now they were different. More distinct. The voices spoke to her, calling her name over and over, taunting her as she fled. They didn't want her to leave. The hospital itself seemed alive, the Gothic walls pressing in, narrowing the corridor as if to trap her inside. Her mind raced as she tried to remember the way back to the entrance, but the hospital had a way of distorting time and space. Each turn she took led her deeper into the maze of darkened halls, the whispers never far behind. The cold became unbearable, seeping into her bones, making each step feel like she was wading through icy water. Margaret reached a large, arched doorway leading into what seemed to be an old surgical ward. The room was enormous, its high ceiling adorned with intricate Gothic carvings that loomed overhead like silent watchers. The air inside was even colder than the hallway, the smell of antiseptic and decay lingering in the air. The room was filled with old surgical tables, their metal rusted and stained with the remnants of a time long past. She paused for a moment, gasping for breath, but the stillness of the room offered no comfort. The whispers were still there, louder now, circling around her like a growing storm. In the shadows at the far end of the ward, she saw them again, those same figures, barely visible, but unmistakably present. They watched her, their hollow eyes filled with a darkness that sent a wave of nausea through her. Without thinking, Margaret turned and fled once more, her shoes slipping on the cracked tiles beneath her. She could feel their presence, closer than ever, the cold breath of the ghosts brushing against the back of her neck. It was as though the hospital itself was leading her into a trap, guiding her to the heart of its twisted, haunted core. As she rounded another corner, the hall opened up into a stairwell. The iron railings were rusted and decayed, the steps creaking ominously underfoot. Margaret hesitated, but the voices behind her urged her forward. With no other choice, she began to descend, the stairwell plunging her deeper into the darkness. The descent seemed endless. The cold grew worse with every step, the air thick with the sense of something ancient and malevolent waiting below. The whispers never left her, following her down the stairs, their tone changing from taunts to something darker, more sinister. Finally, the stairwell opened into a vast, underground chamber. The walls were lined with old, forgotten medical equipment, covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room stood a large, iron door, its surface engraved with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Margaret's flashlight flickered and died. She was alone in the dark. Margaret stood frozen in the pitch-black chamber, her pulse racing as the iron door loomed in front of her. The symbols etched into the surface glowed faintly, casting eerie, shifting patterns on the walls. Her flashlight had died, leaving her with only the cold, suffocating darkness and the oppressive presence that seemed to envelop her. The whispers had quieted now, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence that felt even more terrifying. She took a tentative step forward, her hand brushing against the cold stone wall for support. The air in the room was thick, heavy with the scent of dampness and decay. Margaret's breath hitched as she reached the iron door, her fingers tracing the strange symbols, trying to make sense of them. They pulsed beneath her touch, sending a shiver down her spine. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent, and full of malice. The voices seemed to come from all around her, surrounding her, trapping her in the darkness. Her heart raced as the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. The hospital itself felt alive, a malevolent force that had been waiting for her to reach this point. The door creaked open with a deafening groan, revealing an even darker space beyond. Margaret hesitated, but she knew there was no turning back now. She stepped into the darkness, her senses on high alert. The cold was unbearable now, biting at her skin like icy claws. The voices grew louder, filling the room with their desperate cries, each one more chilling than the last. As she ventured further into the unknown, Margaret saw them again, the ghostly figures that had been haunting her since she entered the old wing. They stood in the shadows, their hollow eyes watching her every move. This time, there was no mistaking their intent. They weren't just watching her, they were waiting. The room stretched out before her, vast and endless, and in the center stood an old hospital bed. A figure lay motionless on the bed, shrouded in darkness. Margaret's blood ran cold as she approached, her every instinct screaming at her to turn back, to flee. But the whispers urged her forward, pushing her toward the figure. As she neared the bed, the figure stirred. Slowly, its head turned to face her, revealing a face twisted in agony, eyes wide with terror. Margaret stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure sat up, its movements jerky and unnatural, and let out a low, guttural moan that echoed through the chamber. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, and the room seemed to close in around her. Shadows danced on the walls, and the ghostly figures moved closer, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Margaret's mind raced, panic overwhelming her as the figure on the bed began to rise, its skeletal form towering over her. She turned and fled, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she ran toward the exit. The whispers chased her, the ghostly figures closing in from all sides. The hospital was alive with their presence, each one a tortured soul trapped within its walls. The darkness seemed to swallow her whole as she sprinted through the endless corridors, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret burst through the entrance to the old wing and into the cold night air. The hospital loomed behind her, dark and silent once more, but the weight of what she had experienced clung to her like a shadow. She knew she had escaped, but the hospital's grip on her would never truly be broken. The voices, the whispers, the shadows, they were part of her now. And as she looked back at the towering, Gothic structure, she realized that no one ever really left the hospital. Not completely. You've just experienced 4 terrifying journeys through haunted hospitals, each one more chilling than the last. From the eerie shadows lurking in a Gothic wing to the whispers of tormented souls that refuse to leave, these stories have taken you deep into places where the living and the dead cross paths. You've heard the distant echoes of patients long gone, seen ghostly figures watching from the dark, and felt the cold breath of spirits that never found peace. Which story gave you the biggest chills? Was it the cursed wing with the haunted iron door or the shadowy figures that followed our characters? Maybe there's a story from your own experience that you'd like to share with us? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, especially where you're watching from. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another horrifying tale. By subscribing, you'll stay connected to all our latest stories and get a front row seat to the scariest content on the web. Thanks for being with us on this chilling journey. We can't wait to see what haunts us next. Until then, stay brave, stay curious, and keep an eye on the shadows. They might just be watching you.